to the October update for Arctic Aurora LifeScience and Arctic Aurora Biotech. So October has been a mixed month for the sector and the portfolios, and we will comment a bit about that in this short video. We have also actually changed format for the short update video this month, because we thought that we should summarize to an even shorter comment on the portfolio and the performance and the main events. And then by the end of this update video, we have included a specific, you can say a specific part where Daniel here will talk about science during the month. So what's the big events of October? The last week of October, I think we got the biggest news, which was that the drug pricing reform in US that we have been talking about was not really included in the package that the Biden administration presented, meaning that it's not at all in the same magnitude as was suggested. So it's not completely off the table, but they haven't been able to agree within the Democratic Party and the different parts of the administration. But we see it as very reduced, and what we do expect though is some inflation capped pricing, which actually the many of the large pharma companies are already applying to. And then secondly, I think there might be some interactions regarding pricing of old products, of patents with low competition, and that's more related to specialty pharma and that type of companies that we do not invest in, since we focus on more innovative companies. So basically, all in all, this feared drug pricing regulation will be postponed for at least a couple of years to come. And that, of course, improved the sentiment for our sector, and the latter part of October was very positive, which we will show later on. Also, since valuations have come down quite significantly, especially of the small mid-cap biotech companies, we see an increased expectation of M&A takeouts, which Daniel will comment on later. One other big item of October already started in September, and that's the oral antiviral, the pills you can take for COVID. And we have seen positive news from Merck receiving big orders from countries around the world, but also, unfortunately, postponement of Atea's development, which hurt our performance during October. And then Aurora will be commented on, which is one of the companies that have been in focus for takeout speculations. And then lastly, as I mentioned, Daniel will discuss the science of the month. And looking at the performance of the different subsectors, like we normally do, we have included in this slide both the S&P and then the different parts of biotech and pharma, where pharma is the blue line, the green line is Nasdaq Biotech Index, and the purple line is the XBI index, which is a proxy for the small mid-cap segment of the sector. And as you might recall, it's been a weak year for the small mid-cap companies. And as I mentioned, valuations have come down. And looking at October specifically, you can see that from this low level, we did see at the end of October a quite steep uptick in the sentiment around XBI, and the XBI went up. So we cannot say that it's a turn of sentiment, but we see signs of it, and valuations are clearly more attractive at those levels after this quite sluggish performance during 2021. So for the performance of the funds, For the larger fund, Arctic Aurora LifeScience, October was more or less flat. We were supported by this stronger sentiment for the sector, but also we had some selection that went wrong. And that is also the reason why the Biotech fund actually had a quite weak month where we were down more than 3%. And to some extent, it is the sector movement in the beginning of October. But I would say that the most of that underperformance is actually due to the fact that the company I mentioned, Atea, did get this delay in its development of the COVID pill. But Daniel will comment on that now.
Thank you, Ulrika. So we already mentioned in the previous month's video that Merck had positive phase 3 data with their antiviral drug molnupiravir. But we'll recap if you missed that video because it was actually an October event. So the phase 3 data that Merck came with included patients that were not hospitalized. So they were, you can say, mild to moderate COVID-19 patients. But one other thing that stood out in patient selections with that clinical trial was that all patients had some sort of risk factor that made them more probable to stumble onto severe disease from COVID. So such risk factors could be obesity, for example. We know that's a very known risk factor for severe disease, immunocompromised patients, diabetic patients, patients with some sort of pre-existing respiratory illness, for example. And in that patient group, molnupiravir did really well and considerably lowered the chance for these patients to enter hospitalized care or death. There were no deaths, for example, in the molnupiravir trial arm for that clinical trial versus placebo, where there were 8 deaths. So with that, this month, Merck announced that they will apply for so-called emergency use authorization, a quick approval, if you like, in the US. And with that application came the notice of an FDA advisory committee meeting to discuss the clinical data on November 30, so already this month in November. In addition, they also initiated a rolling review in the EU, also to expedite that process. So I think it looks likely that we'll see an emergency use for this pill in a short matter of time. But there's some interesting aspects of this drug that will be discussed in the advisory committee. For example, the safety with that drug. It is known to be potentially so-called mutagenic in that it interacts with the DNA, and that could be potentially harmful. And short term, because you're only using this drug for a couple of days, it probably isn't a huge concern, but you are not allowed, for example, to use this in pregnant women, for example. So as Ulrika mentioned, in parallel to this, Atea, with their partners Roche, announced negative phase 2 trial data with their antiviral drug called AT527. Now, they also used non-hospitalized patients. However, the trial group was quite different. So they included a much larger spectrum of patients, and not only those high-risk patients. And that apparently, as we know now, changes the probability of a pronounced effect with these antiviral pills. So we can conclude, I think, from the Atea data that you should focus on the risk factor patients when administering these drugs. So Atea and Roche acknowledge this and are changing their protocol for their ongoing phase 3 trial. So that's probably a good thing. However, it does induce a quite severe delay. So that study won't read out until the second half of next year. So obviously a negative for Atea and Roche, and Atea stock slumped almost around 70% last month, which is, of course, a considerable downturn and also affected our fund's performance this month. So with that, I think we can jump to a more positive stock mover, Aurora, that Ulrika mentioned. So this is another company that we actually discussed last month because they, in their Q2 report, they announced some new guidance in their sales. So this was a drug that was launched for the autoimmune disease lupus nephritis in January, and sales were considerably slow for the first half year with only 7 million in sales. However, when that number was announced, company guided for up to 50 million in sales for the full year of 2021. And that with that, investors became much more positive to the stock, and we can see an uptick already during September. Now, with potential successful drugs comes interest from big pharma, and rumors have started to emerge during the month of a potential acquisition by Bristol Myers Squibb, and then later on more companies were joined in this rumors of a takeout with Glaxo, Roche, and Japanese Otsuka also mentioned, and so the stock performed really well, went from 20s to the 30s in terms of stock price in dollars. So we're eagerly looking forward to what will happen with this, if it stays just a rumor or we'll have another biotech takeout. And I think we should mention that we do see much more interest in M&A in the biotech field. We've already seen some high-profile takeouts during, let's say, since the summer when this thing started to heat up again. And I think pharma perhaps are taking advantage of the slightly lower valuation of these biotech companies. So eagerly looking forward to Aurora and looking forward to next month. So a few things that we should mention is sort of an onslaught of scientific conferences. We're very eager to follow these because often we see a lot of new data being presented at these conferences, starting with the American Society of Nephrology. For example, we have a biotech company called Reata that are in regulatory process right now that will announce more data on their kidney drug. The Alzheimer's disease conference called CTAD has been very eagerly followed in the last few years with the clinical data and then subsequent approval of Biogen's Aduhelm in Alzheimer's. Another very hot topic, of course, is immunotherapy in cancer. So the Society of Immunotherapy in Cancers was a tiny conference only 15 years ago and had grown to big monster with a lot of company presenting data, including big ones like Merck and Bristol and smaller upcoming biotechs. And then the American Association of the Study of Liver Diseases. So companies involved in liver diseases could be hepatitis or more rare liver diseases, for example, will have data presented there. So we're paying close attention to those conferences. So in addition, we are expecting some high-profile data readouts from various companies during, well, November or during Q4. It's always difficult to say exactly when that data will be. We have two cancer readouts from Gilead expected in their drug Trodelvy, an acquisition by a biotech company called Immunotherapeutics last year, and then another compound that they fairly recently acquired, magrolimab, will have potentially registrational data in a blood disorder during Q4. And then in inflammation, we'll have two phase 3 readouts from Allakos Therapeutics. So looking forward to those data sets as well.
So all in all, it's quite a dense news flow coming up the rest of the year now. And for Gilead, it's really important to see whether they can show us that they have this improving future and a new growth phase. So with that, this first part of the update video is finished, and then we will move over to the science part where Daniel will explain to you what we have been looking at during October, and also going forward, hopefully we can include some comments in each of the monthly updates to kind of explain and to keep focus on the interesting and super exciting things happening in medical science.
So for the first time in these videos, we were eager to present to you some of the stuff that we're looking into, some of the newer interesting stuff that are hitting sort of the biotech radar. Starting today with a very exciting growing field called protein degradation. So looking at the first slide there and trying to explain what this is, let's go back to basics a little bit and see sort of where proteins fit into the therapeutic paradigms. Let's start with DNA. So this is the blueprint, of course, for all life. We all have these DNA molecules in our cells. They tell basically the cells how to produce proteins. Now that information is carried from the cell nucleus by a molecule called RNA. So that information is then moved into the cell, into the protein creation machinery, where you have these proteins being manufactured. You can also see here that you can target these different levels of molecular biology with different types of treatment. So with DNA, for example, we can target this with gene therapy, inserting genes where, for example, a gene is not functioning very well. And then, of course, another new sort of field coming up, growing is gene editing. For example, CRISPR, where you can do more precision cuts and actually change the smallest constituents of the DNA in order for it to correct for certain diseases. Or you can move to RNA and trying to interfere there, for example, by disturbing the signals. And when you disturb the signals, proteins are not being able to be produced. And that could be very helpful. If you have a protein that is causing disease, you can stop it already at RNA level. So you have RNA interference, for example, that we've spoken a lot about, some very interesting companies working with that. Same thing with antisense treatments working similarly in trying to silence the RNA. And then a new field called mRNA, which is so far only used in vaccines, but we all know sort of the potential there with the new COVID-19 vaccines that are actually working quite well. And with mRNA, you're not taking away information, you're actually adding information. So letting the cells create completely new proteins. So that's quite exciting. Now moving to protein level. So this is the target of classical medical therapy. So either with small chemical molecules, they can interact with proteins and, for example, silence them or even accentuate their function, or antibodies is a field that's been working for us in the last 25, 30 years. So again, trying to interact with the proteins. What you can do is silence these proteins already when they're made. And this is the new protein degradation field. So I made this very fancy cartoon at the bottom of the page where you have this green blob, which is the protein that you're trying to silence. Now, the natural way of this, called sort of the life cycle of proteins, if you like, is that there are enzymes in our cells that I am, for this example, are calling scouting enzymes. So they're scouting the cells for proteins that are damaged, probably by just staying in the cells for too long. And this is a way of just recycling the material, because if the cells aren't degrading the proteins by themselves, you're just going to have buildup of proteins until they fill up the entire cell. So you need this sort of cleaning machinery. So the degradation scout enzyme attaches to the protein that needs to be recycled. And when it does that, it actually flags the protein. I've added a nice little flag there. So that it enters the degradation machinery. And this is illustrated by this blender here that basically shreds the protein into pieces, and then the pieces can be recycled in the cells to build new proteins. So that's well, but you can also use this for a therapeutic effect. So protein degradation drugs, this new field, are small molecules that links together this scouting enzyme with the target protein. So a protein that's not supposed to go into the recycling machine does so either way. And this is good if you have a disease-causing protein, so you can destroy the protein and hopefully make patients better. So that's why we have a group of companies now coming in with novel approaches in protein degradation. And I'll give you a couple of examples to see what they have shown. The first one is Arvina. So this is one of the pioneering companies in protein degradation, focusing primarily on cancer, but we'll see they have other stuff as well. We have a chart there of their clinical pipeline. And what you can see there is that their initial focus in clinical development has been in hormone-sensitive breast cancer and in prostate cancer. So in certain types of breast cancer, you have hormonal receptors that are acting as the growth drivers of cancers, which is difficult because targeting these growth receptors will probably also lead you to interfere with normal, for example, estrogen metabolism in our bodies. So drugs that are targeting these estrogen receptors come with quite a few side effects as well that are not beneficial for the patients. So Arvinas has created a drug that targets these hormone receptors. So that's the protein that Arvinas are trying to degrade here. And the initial data was very encouraging. So what they've shown in heavily treated patients with breast cancer is very competitive efficacy data compared to more traditional hormone-directed drugs. One of them is fulvestrant, which is very commonly used to treat breast cancer. And in addition, safety appears competitive. And this is one thing that's very interesting with protein degradation, in that normally when we look at new molecules for therapeutic use, we want them to be very potent and very selective and be very sort of aggressive on the target, but it also means that you can have potential high loads of side effects that you don't want. And the good thing with protein degraders is that you can make the molecule themselves pretty benign, so that little linker that we showed in the previous slide can be quite weak, but that weak binding is enough to induce these protein degradation. And that's the good thing about this new field, that you can make very effective drugs that are also very safe. And mind you, again, this is early data, so we wouldn't want to draw too many conclusions from this, but it looks very promising. So promising, in fact, that when the data emerged, Pfizer decided to in-license this breast cancer program for $1 billion in upfront payments and up to $1.4 million in regulatory and commercial milestones to Arvinas. And for that, Pfizer actually only receives 50% of the commercial rights for this drug, and Arvinas keeps the rest of it. And that's an indication, I think, of how promising this technology is, that even a big pharma name want to go in at this early stage to have a piece of the cake, essentially. Now, Arvinas are moving forward with phase 3 programs within breast cancer and also exploring earlier lines of use, because that's where you can reach many more patients. And I also mentioned that they are in prostate cancer, advancing that program. And in addition, they have some exciting stuff in central nervous system diseases, because here, some of you may be familiar with diseases such as Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, because here also you have proteins that are causing a lot of damage to the nerve cells, and you can potentially clean those proteins out with this protein degradation approach, then perhaps you can have a very interesting clinical effect. We have to wait and see, of course, before we see any data there, but an exciting future project here for Arvinas. And we also want to mention a second company called Nurex that are also in the protein degradation field, because they had data in October. So this is a very recent development. They are targeting for their lead program a protein known as BTK, or Bruton's tyrosine kinase, and this is an important cancer-driving protein in many lymphomas and leukemias. So Nurex presented data, again, early stage phase 1 data in lymphoma patients with their protein-degrading drug 2127, and this data shown that they were able to degrade 90% of the BTK protein in their highest dose, which also appeared very safe. So again, back to safety. And this could be a very competitive edge on the traditional drugs that are targeting BTK with more traditional approaches and trying to just bind the protein and hope it can play out its function as a cancer driver. So very interesting data there. Looking forward to more stuff from Nurex. They also, by the way, have collaborations with big biotech and big pharma. Gilead and Sanofi has rights for a few of their future programs. And as you can see, we also added some logos in the bottom there for more biotech and large, actually, pharma companies working with this. So I think in the next few years, we'll see a lot more data from this growing field of protein degradation that we feel is very promising based on the early stage stuff that we've seen so far. So I hope you enjoyed this little deep dive into a very exciting new field within biotechnology. So see you next month for another update, and I think for another deep dive in the biotech world. Goodbye.